It's Saturday, September 7th, 2019, and thank you for joining us for this archive of the second Saturday webinar of the 2019-2020 school year. This year's topic is American Minds, in which we have chosen 10 different Americans from the colonial era to the 20th century to look at their impact on public life, their impact on ideas, letters, politics, all manner of things. Today's focus was Benjamin Franklin, a man that some would say was perhaps the original American or the first American, the model American. In any case, you can learn more about our free webinars for teachers and anyone else at tah.org. Go to Programs and then look up Webinars. Thanks again for joining us.
Well, good morning and welcome to another teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar sponsored by Ashbrook at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett. I teach politics and history here at Ashland, and I'm also co-director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program for undergraduate students at Ashland University. The theme of our webinar series this year is American Minds, and I think we're kind of taking our bearing from that term as Jefferson uses it. Thomas Jefferson uses it in his letter to Henry Lee. And if you're joining us for the first time, just so you know, our purpose is to pull together some thoughtful scholars and have a conversation this year about 10 important persons in U.S. history who either reflect or have influenced the American mind, or both. And we encourage all of you joining us to participate in our conversation by submitting questions in the chat box. And as always, we'll try to get to those as much as possible, to as many of those as possible. And I encourage our scholars today joining us, if you see a question come up in the chat feature, please feel free to address anything you'd like to address. Let me also mention in the next week, you'll receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation. And it will also include a link to the archived video and audio of today's program. As always, we recommend documents. We like to start our conversations from documents or get into documents during our conversations. And as always, we're drawing from our extensive collection of documents at tah.org. Today, we're talking about Benjamin Franklin. And I'm happy to introduce our scholars for today, Todd Estes of Oakland University and David Tucker of Ashbrook. Thank you both very much for being here this morning. I really look forward to hearing all of your thoughts on Franklin. He's one of my favorites to study and discuss. A very interesting and important person. I'm especially interested in your thoughts on how Franklin thought about religion, virtue, morality, civic responsibility, and these sorts of things. I'm going to start though by throwing out a kind of broad question, and then as always, I say this every webinar, you're free to either ignore my question and do what you want, or address it, or riff on it. But Woodrow Wilson once wrote that Benjamin Franklin really wasn't an American. I think Woodrow Wilson actually said the first real American was Andrew Jackson. And that always kind of bothered me, that Woodrow Wilson, he had his criteria, I'm sure, but I've always thought of Benjamin Franklin in many ways as the first sort of model American, I don't want to say real American, but really a model American. So is it fair to say Franklin is American and perhaps even the first American? Any broad thoughts on these things? I'll defer to either of you. Whoever wants to jump in first, please.
David, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, I would say he is, and I guess I would defend this view in that I think Franklin, more actually than any of the other founders, faced the question of what this new experiment in government meant for most of the people who were going to be part of it and how they should live. And I thought the readings give various examples of some of the things he did or suggested to, help people understand how they should live. But there is another sense in which, and I don't know, that's the first time I'd ever heard that Woodrow Wilson said that Benjamin Franklin wasn't really an American. But I'm not really sure what Wilson meant. But on the other hand, it's true that Franklin was out of the country for long periods of time. And there's even this passage in the autobiography where he says, if only people had listened to me at the time of the Albany Union, we could have avoided the American Revolution. And there's a certain sense in which you might say Franklin was too big a personality and too big a mind to fit in America, and he would rather have taken over the British Empire. So that's just an opening comment. I'd be interested to hear what Todd has to say.
Yeah, I think those are good points. I think one thing I would add, and this is something we'll certainly unpack in our conversation this morning, and probably the teachers will have some questions as well, is that Franklin is unique, I think, in many ways, in that he, for a longer period of time than most, and in a variety of ways, really sort of straddled a variety of different worlds, a North American world, a European world, a distinctly North American US world, a world of striving and development and artisanship on his own, as well as worlds of science and diplomacy and politics. So Franklin, in many ways, I think during his lifetime, was seen as a symbol of a variety of different strands of what would often come together to be called Americanness or American behavior or American traits and characteristics. But I think he also was sort of always navigating and always straddling, in part because he was a major go-between between the colonies and the British, between the colonies and Europe, as a scientist, as a thinker, as a writer, as a humorist, and certainly as a diplomat and a politician. So I think one of the things you will see with Franklin is he is very firmly rooted in the North American colonies. And so he is a man of North America in that sense. But I think he's also more broadly, a man of the world, in the sense that he traveled, was known widely, people knew of him even if they didn't know him. And so I think all those things sort of enter into not only who Franklin was in his lifetime, but as I hope we'll discuss today, who Franklin became in terms of the image and the symbol and the sort of mythology that has followed him arguably right down to the present day.
Yeah, Todd, on that last point, that's what I have in mind when I think of Franklin as an American, the image of Franklin, right? What he's sort of come down to us as through time. He represents certain things that we think of as very American in the way he talks about certain things. So I think those are great opening comments from both of you. Thank you. And again, back on one of David's points, your first point about in what sense Franklin was American, in the sense that he had an understanding that this was a new kind of experiment or political experiment. It was unfair of me to throw Woodrow Wilson at you this morning, by the way, both of you. I apologize for that. But I think what Wilson had in mind was Franklin, and the way Franklin thought about things was still too much rooted in the old world way of thinking about things. And Andrew Jackson, he says, I think was the first one who was freed from any sense of obligation of thinking like an old world European. But I still think that's unfair for the reasons both of you have given of Franklin. He obviously recognizes that even long before the revolution, that there's something very different and unique about life in what we think of as America, but were colonies at the time, in the sense that we didn't quite have the sort of legal or political framework that you had back in Great Britain. There's no legal. I mean, there is, but it's much looser in terms of a formal aristocracy, and that fact alone seems to me to have influenced Franklin's understanding or thoughts on the need for community projects, community helping each other build their communities, the need for a new, different kind of private and civic morality, and even a sense of philanthropy, right? The importance of philanthropy in this new regime, if we can call it that, in the absence of the sort of political and social framework of Great Britain in this new society, we have to come up with new ways of thinking about those things that work for us. So that's kind of how I was thinking of Franklin, in the sense that he's new and American, in the sense that he's not quite old world in that sense. But so,
well, there's a way in which Franklin is, if that's what Woodrow Wilson meant, you could say in a way that Franklin was more at home in Europe, especially in Paris, than Jefferson was. Um, Jefferson and Franklin are similar in certain respects, but I think it's my own understanding of Jefferson is that he really saw Paris as more problematic and European society as more problematic than Franklin did. Although ultimately Franklin, spent his last years in the United States and so forth. That's just another example of what Todd was saying about Franklin being a cosmopolitan in a way that I don't think even Jefferson was. Although Jefferson certainly admired things about Europe, he was not entirely comfortable, and a lot of that had to do with the politics or his politics and what he saw as the way in which people in Europe were tyrannized by the forms of government and even some social conventions and so forth. Franklin seems to have moved much more comfortably in that world than Jefferson did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think Franklin was, in many ways, Franklin has a very almost modern understanding of the relationship of the colonies and the Atlantic world and Europe. I mean, that has sort of been the large focus of scholarship, at least in history, the last couple of decades, is to focus not just on the mainland colonies, the 13 colonies, the struggle for independence, but to think in terms of an Atlantic world that involves Great Britain, other British colonies, the Atlantic world, Africa and the slave trade, and the North American colonies as being part of this global web. And Franklin was very much not only aware of that, but plugged into it as a merchant, as a printer, as a writer, as a traveler, and certainly later as a diplomat as well. And so I think one of the things that is unique to Franklin's concept of what is an American, of being an American, of what does America mean in a broad sense, is that it's always informed, I think, as David was suggesting, by this cosmopolitan understanding of the place of the colonies in the Atlantic world and in Europe more generally. And he was thinking in terms of problems of the empire. When I think Chris brought up the idea of the Albany Congress back in 1754, that's extraordinarily early for most people on the American side of the Atlantic to be thinking in terms of union and independence and empire. And yet Franklin was sort of already there thinking about how these pieces mesh together. And so I think he was uniquely aware, or maybe not uniquely, but keenly aware of the significance of the Great War for Empire, which ended with a British victory over the French in 1763 and essentially cleared the French out of North America to open it up for British control with the American colonies right there with them. So I think Franklin's cosmopolitan nature, his global concept of things, his very imperial way of thinking, really has a lot to do with how he conceives of America and conceives of the American place in the broader world, of what it can be, and also just as clearly what it should not be or could not be.
But I think there's kind of an irony in this, in that one criticism of Franklin is that he represents that what's seen by some people as that small-minded boosterism, local boosterism, made fun of by various people in American history, Mencken or somebody. You could pick one of these satirists, these local strivers, who run their shop and do some civic improvements and so forth. And it's a kind of irony. I mean, to me, if it's Jefferson in his praise of farming and his talk of farming, and Franklin with his praise of and really describing the life of a civic-minded shop owner, they kind of encapsulate what's American and what is often criticized as being, again, small-minded, localist, and so forth. So it's kind of an irony that this very cosmopolitan man is, in some respects, criticized for being the author of Main Street boosterism, small town boosterism in America.
Right.
But at a certain point, Franklin. So we may get that impression from the autobiography, a good portion of which, at least in book one, is just describing that aspect of Franklin's life, right, David? I mean, it's that sort of self-help. It's come to be thought of as the original improvement story, working hard, he runs a shop, improves it, and is able to do some good things for Philadelphia in the process. But at a certain point, after he gets into politics, he expands his view, does he not? I mean, he obviously is important in continental politics. He's there for he's there in the Continental Congress for the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He's invited to or I should say, appointed as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. So, he's remembered in some ways as that provincial sort of character, but he does become known as a national. Now I want to say national. To be careful here, prior to the Declaration of Independence, even before that, he's well known throughout the colonies, is he not? As a sort of American figure, at least in the minds of people in the American colonies. Or am I wrong about that? Is his fame does his sort of fame come before or after the Revolution? Do either of you know? His sort of
Well, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think it's 1731 when he was about 25, I think, when he founded the Library Company of Philadelphia and then the Fire Company of Philadelphia and a whole bunch of other civic groups that have long been associated with him. And I think Franklin had a large local reputation and a large reputation among well-connected people in the colonies because for his fairly modest background, he made wealth early and was able to essentially retire and become a man of leisure early. Now, he never quite retired because he was always doing something, which of course is another part of the Franklin story and the Franklin legend. But I think Franklin was well known certainly for what he did in the colonies, but he was also, I think, significantly known in Europe. And Europeans knew him well, they read him, they respected him. His correspondence network was vast. And I think because of that, Franklin was, to many Europeans, he was the symbol and the potential for what the American nation could become. And he was also, for them, often the only American they might know, either directly or indirectly. So I think his reputation, in some ways, might have been even larger in Europe, ironically, than in the colonies, which has more to do, I think, with the lack of roads, transportation mechanisms, and the shortcomings of being able to circulate print, like newspapers or pamphlets, very widely beyond simply a local area, which was still a concern and a problem up to and beyond the American Revolution.
Well, I think part of that is it may be, that Franklin's reputation in Europe was more as a scientist and then as a diplomat, and in the United States he would have been more known for his, I think, for his political work, but also for his writing and that, Poor Richard's Almanac. Not to say that that was not read in Europe, but I think his reputation as a scientist was probably greater in Europe than in the United States, at least initially. And then there was kind of a reflection of his reception in Europe back into the United States as his reputation grew. But there's also a sense that and again, this gets back to what we were saying towards the beginning. There is a way in which Franklin did lose touch with what was going on in the United States, being away for so long. One of there's a chat question from
Shaylin.
I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name.
Yeah. Shaylin. Yeah.
Shaylin, could you discuss Franklin's extensive time in England and France, or how Franklin's extensive time in England and France influenced his understanding of America? And I'd be interested to know what Todd thinks of that. But for me, I think that I don't think that his time in Europe had an effect on his views, except that he remained committed to the British Empire, I think, longer than other people who were prominent in American politics, or who ended up on the side of the Patriots when the revolution finally occurred. And that, I think, was partly because he did, having spent so much time out of the country representing colonies, principally Pennsylvania, but some others, and then his time in France and so forth, that he in a way had lost touch with America to some degree. but I don't know that I wouldn't say that his time overseas fundamentally affected his outlook on things or his understanding of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think he learned broadly from experience as well as reading and correspondence and conversation. And in fact, as we looked at some of the readings, he has these very ambitious plans for how people should sit down and talk and converse with each other and learn by asking questions and reconsider your opinions and be willing to be open to new views or new interpretations. And I think Franklin, in many cases, not all, but many cases, followed that advice that he gave and did that himself. And I think Franklin also, in terms of the European connection, he was I think someone who, as David had mentioned, was in some ways, and this was difficult to do, Franklin was often trying to navigate between the colonies and Great Britain because he was very well placed and very influential within the British Empire. He knew the major players. He knew the power brokers in Parliament and in British politics and society. And he understood that they, as nearly everybody expected, that if there was a colonial rebellion, that the British would be able to put it down. And so Franklin is always sort of operating to try to both represent American interests, the interest of the colonies, that is, to communicate those ideas to the British, to communicate back to the colonists the British views and positions on things. And so he has this, he's sort of forced to have a very subtle and sophisticated understanding of imperial relations and how things relate to on both sides of the Atlantic, how they connect to each other. And so I think in that sense, he often is sort of either ahead of the curve or behind the curve a little bit in ways that do get him in trouble at times. He has a couple of public controversies where he tries to have some letters printed, or actually he tries to share the information, doesn't want it printed, but it gets printed anyway, about Thomas Hutchinson, and tries to blame the imperial crisis on the royal governor of Massachusetts. So there are all kinds of ways in which Franklin is sort of having to answer to Parliament, answer to his fellow colonists back in the colonies. And it's a very difficult position. And I think part of what makes Franklin, to me, so interesting is the kind of ambiguity in trying to nail him down. I mean, scholars have often commented on Franklin being a man of many masks, and Franklin being someone who is at home in all kinds of worlds, but never truly at home in any one. And I think it's that ambiguity, it's that difficult, that elusiveness, the difficulty of pinning him down that both makes him so successful at being able to straddle multiple worlds, but also makes it difficult for us looking back to try to say, well, Franklin is this, or he's that, or he's something else. I think he's almost always in between, and in that state of what we might call liminality, I guess would be the scholarly term to use, where you're not quite here or there, but you're sort of straddling the margins in various ways. And I think in that sense, Franklin is a fascinating character, but then also deeply significant, as David was saying, for the relationship between the colonies and Europe.
Yeah, that's really well put. It's really a lot of interesting things going on here. So I'd love to get into the text here, but if you'll indulge me, I just have maybe two quick follow-up questions to some points that both of you are raising. Todd, you were talking about some of the controversies Franklin found himself in as a sort of political player while he was in England, and this was before. I think this was, if I remember correctly, this was before well, I don't know if it was before the revolution began or if it was before we declared independence. Franklin was in, I believe, England on business, if I'm not mistaken, and then this involved these letters. He was put on trial, was he not? It wasn't really a trial, but he was called before Parliament for questioning. Do you remember this event?
Mm-hmm.
And he felt he was sort of manhandled and treated unfairly and unjustly. Could this be a turning point in terms of Franklin shifting from thinking politically in terms of the British Empire to moving toward thinking about independence? Or is that too simplistic?
Well, I think there's a lot more that goes into it as we can talk about, but that's certainly a key point when he's brought before Parliament and essentially asked how would the colonies feel about taxation, and the whole question of internal taxation versus external taxation comes up, and Franklin is sort of really put on the spot to be the spokesperson for the American colonies, which he's not really able to do because he's not in correspondence with everyone. He has no clear mandate or instructions or things like that. And so he's got to be careful that he's not disloyal to the British Empire, obviously, while still staking out the position that Americans have. And that's a very awkward position. He faced a lot of hostility there. He certainly faced criticism back in the colonies based on things he said and how that played out. And there were several instances like that where Franklin is sort of called to represent the American position in Parliament and in London. And that's both a great sign of the respect that Franklin commanded, but also a sign of the difficulty that he was in, of having to be careful always who he's representing, who he's speaking of. If Franklin was speaking in terms of us and them, who is us, who is them? And are the colonies us and the British in the Parliament them? Is everybody us and it's an internal squabble? Those are difficult questions. And Franklin, I think, navigated that about as well as anybody could have, but it was still very treacherous going. And I think ultimately when the break did come in 1775 with the war and 76 with the Declaration, in many ways, that solved an enormous problem for Franklin. That sort of got him off the hook, as it were, because he could then plainly be an American and begin to talk about what that means and what the nation is about, and not have to try to straddle these worlds and explain one party to the other party, and then go back and translate to the first party what the second party had been saying.
Yeah.
But I think it is true, though, that you could look at Franklin's treatment by the British government as an example of the what I guess you could call the stupidity of its policy towards the colonies as a whole. In other words, if they had treated Franklin better, the episode Chris is referring to, a very hostile interrogation, which was clearly intended to humiliate Franklin and so forth. That you might say that was Franklin's personal intolerable action.
Yeah.
As opposed to the intolerant acts. If the British had had a more enlightened policy, the revolution might never have occurred. And we don't really know what Franklin would have done in that case. He might have gone on, if the empire, if that first British Empire had remained intact, if he had been treated better, he might have gone on to be a leading figure in that British Empire. I guess you could say the stupidity of British policy towards Franklin and towards the colonies made that impossible.
But is it too much of an overstatement to say that the treatment of Franklin was considered by some, maybe even Franklin himself, as a sign of the treatment of America as a whole? I mean, abusing Franklin is an abuse of America. They'd be stretching things too much, but.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Todd does. I don't know of a place where Franklin himself ever drew that connection. But looking back at it, it seems to me that you could say that in a way. Franklin had influence, obviously, in the United States, and they could have used that in a better way. They didn't really use it. They were very high-handed in their treatment of Franklin and of the colonies.
Yeah.
So that it's hard to say. You talk about these counterfactuals, but it's interesting to think about what might have happened if the British had had a different approach.
Yeah. James just submitted a question. Did Franklin ponder staying in Great Britain, thinking that the American colonies were uncivilized? I like your chuckle, David.
I mean, to me, I would say you'd have to ask at what point. I think, it's clear in Franklin's writings that he left Europe reluctantly. But I think that, and in that sense, I think he at one point was thinking of a future that would be more in Europe than it would have been in the United States, and what became the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know whether, I think David makes a good point about which year are we talking about, where are we in the sequence of events as to when he might have thought this. But I think in a lot of ways, there is for Franklin a way in which thinking about a career or thinking about a move to Great Britain would make perfect sense as long as the empire was still together, because that would be obviously the financial center, the political center, the economic center, the cultural center of the British Empire. And for Franklin, who is so well connected anyway, and traverses both sides of the Atlantic so well, being in Great Britain for all kinds of reasons would make perfect sense to him. I think eventually, obviously, he comes to become clearly an American figure. And then as he writes about this, as he sort of self-fashions in his autobiography, then I think we can sort of see examples of where Franklin is, sort of from the beginning presenting himself as, well, I was always skeptical. I never really trusted those guys. And there are ways in which Franklin tries to craft a narrative that makes him a little bit more prescient than he probably was, or than anybody could be. And then certainly as later Americans, once Franklin died, as later Americans took over and began to fashion the Franklin myth, then he is sort of from the beginning presented as someone who was always ready to stand up and fight for American independence. So I think it does depend very much on, to answer that question, who we're talking about, when we're talking about, and whether we're talking about what Franklin himself said or did, or what other people have said about him, or what Franklin, in fact, presented as the sort of mythology of Ben Franklin in the autobiography.
Yeah, that's great. And again, this is fascinating, this idea of Franklin's myth. And some of the things both of you were saying earlier made me think that even when Franklin was around, we were talking about how he was portrayed by Europe, or how he was viewed by Europeans. He's got some myth-like qualities in a way, even while he's alive. And I think it was David earlier mentioned that Franklin was known in many circles in Europe, at least in English circles, I think you mentioned specifically, as for his scientific activities and his scientific research. But how do we explain I'm sorry to bring the conversation down to this level in a way, but how do we explain Benjamin Franklin and the raccoon skin cap thing? I'm not asking the question very well. He's an interesting and enigmatic character in this sense, from how Europeans think of him. So he's thought of as this intelligent, inventive mind in certain circles, but then he shows up in a coonskin cap, and he's kind of what's the word I'm looking for? I wouldn't say an oddity, but the French. I just know the French got a kick out of the fact that he would show up wearing a coonskin cap, which sort of represents that uncivilized, or that rougher side of America. Can we balance? I don't know if we can balance those two things, but I guess my question is, did Todd made me think of this. How much did Franklin cultivate his own image? While he was alive?
I think constantly. I think he was always aware of that. He was always aware that he was we would call it today a personality, a presence. It doesn't translate exactly that way to the 17th century, 18th century, I mean, but Franklin was clearly somebody who was aware of his impact on other people and of the symbolism of things that he did. So just as, say, Thomas Jefferson, famously as president, greeted the British minister at the White House wearing slippers as a way of, I'm going to communicate a lack of respect for you by doing this. Franklin was always aware of how his actions, his clothing, his statements, his manner, his behavior would be seen by others. And so I think there's the personal that Franklin does that way. But then I think when Franklin writes in the autobiography and many of his letters in the Almanac, you can see Franklin. I mean, one of the challenges that scholars have, that all of us have in reading Franklin, is to figure out, is he putting us on? Is he playing us? Is he conning us? Is he trying to point at the humor here? Is he writing ironically? Is he writing straightforwardly? It's possible to read Franklin in all kinds of ways. And so you're never quite sure. Even Franklinian scholars have often admitted, I can't really tell if he's being serious here or playful. And I think the self-fashioning, the presentation is all part of it, right down to the hat. And there's many people may know. I know I was sort of raised on this book, a great book by, I think it's Robert Lawson, called Ben and Me, about a mouse and Ben Franklin, and this mouse follows him through. It's a classic children's book. I think there's also one about Paul Revere as well. Great books, and that sort of is part of the way of, starting that myth, spreading the myth of Franklin, even to young grade schoolers and young children. that's been perpetuated in a lot of ways by even by serious scholarship as well. So yeah, it's a great question, Chris, to bring up.
Well, he clearly knew he was presenting himself as the natural man in contrast to the artificiality of the courts of Europe and so forth. And you remember there was kind of a fashion for this. Marie Antoinette had a little farm.
That's very
Go
interesting.
and grow things because, get in touch with nature and that sort of thing. And Franklin knew enough and was self-aware enough, as Todd was saying, to pick up on that and present himself in that way to build his influence and this, if you will, myth about himself and America. And he was not, as we know, I mean, Franklin was not a creature of the wilderness. He wasn't, he was a completely urban character. So that kind of presentation of himself as a rustic was really artificial.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point. I had forgotten about that. So he's in France, circulating among the sort of philosophes, right? Who were certainly, I mean, the craze then was this sort of Rousseauian idea of going back to nature and the virtues associated with that. So that's a great point. Yeah, they would have eaten that up. So yeah, fantastic. We have a number of other questions, but I think some of them I think we've covered or touched on a little bit. I'd love to get into the text a little bit. You both recommended these texts, and I think these are great selections. So just throw out a broad question. Which of these texts do you think best represents these various aspects of Franklin's mind and character that we've been discussing? Where do we see some of these things that we've been talking about in these various documents? Or another way you could think of them as, how do these documents reflect something of what's come to be thought of as American or the American mind? Where do we see the American mind in these documents? Either of you care to start getting us into the documents a little bit?
You want to go ahead, Todd?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a lot of great things here to talk about, and I think pretty much everything Franklin wrote is fascinating in some way for whatever reason. So you can throw a stick in any direction of Franklin writings and come up with something that's interesting to look at. One thing that I think we put on our list was Franklin's essay about the morals of chess, which is of course part of playing chess, but obviously it's about much more than that. And it's sort of a game of rules for how to navigate life, for how to deal with other people, for how to be self-aware, to be looking for clues and hidden clues and things like that. I mean, you can do so many fascinating readings of these. And I think some of the really interesting work on Franklin has been done not only by historians or political theorists, but by literary critics who have read Franklin simply as a producer of text. The late Robert Ferguson, who was a great scholar at Columbia for many years, has written quite a bit about Franklin and other early American writers. And I think Ferguson and so many others have had some really smart things to say about Franklin's writing. But if you look at that essay on chess, there's all kinds of advice there that you can it applies differently, I think, to each of us as readers. So each of us reading this essay, which is a short piece, can look at this and say, okay, well, here's the part that's, if you're actually playing chess, this would work. But if you're dealing with your family, this might work. If you're dealing with a situation at work or something else, this could work. If you're thinking about a larger political issue, these kinds of things might work. There's so much interesting advice here, and it works, I think, on so many levels, that's one of the great keys, I think, to any great piece of writing, is that it speaks broadly to lots of people, but it also speaks in various ways, in different valences and different voices, and it speaks to them on multiple levels as well. So you kind of read this essay and you sort of, if you're aware of all the different levels that it's working on, all the different kinds of work that it's doing, I just think it's a great piece because it gives you some advice that any reader could then take and transfer to whatever situation they're thinking about, whatever aspect of their life could apply it to. So it's both philosophical advice in a kind of abstract sense, but it could also be then converted into deeply pragmatic advice. And I think it's that pragmatism, that pragmatic Franklin, that's one of the keys that comes out in so many of these things.
Yeah, that's really well put. Yeah, it seems that Franklin he gives so much advice, and good advice, I think, in so many of his writings. He really does seem to be concerned with how, what's the best way for one to live. Again, not in some abstract Socratic sense, right? He's not writing the Republic or something like that,
Mhm.
but in a very practical way in your day-to-day life. What sorts of advice does he gives to people so that they can end up, it seems to me, ultimately be happy.
Mhm.
So he seems to be really concerned about how people ought to live in a way that will make them happy. There's, again, so many great pieces of advice in that Morals of Chess, right? So it teaches you foresight, thinking ahead.
Mhm.
You don't give up because you never know what might happen down the road. One wrong move or one right move.
Mhm.
I think does he mention learning how to lose well, and
Yeah,
all sorts of great
exactly.
things in life. And that seems to me to be a common theme, as you're saying, Todd, in a lot of these writings, especially of course, the Poor Richard piece. We're also really familiar with, maybe his most familiar piece. But
Mhm.
I'm always struck by how many sayings. I remember reading that for the first time in college, that Poor Richard piece, The Way to Wealth, and I was struck at how many of those things my grandparents used to say to me. I mean, word for word, right? It's amazing how those have been handed down. But I don't want to get us too far off topic. So,
But I think to me that the piece is interesting because it shows, and you can see why people might be critical of it. This is not, Bobby Fischer, the mad chess genius. This is a very rational, self-controlled approach to things. And it's that kind of rational self-control, which a lot of people, I think, have criticized Franklin for. Or at the end, where he says his last bit of advice is, in a way, size up the situation. And if it's really not a rigorous game of chess, then help your opponent out by suggesting that maybe that wasn't the best move he could make. And Franklin says at the end, by this generous civility, so opposite to the unfairness above forbidden, you may indeed happen to lose the game to your opponent, but you will win what is better, his esteem, his respect, and his affection, together with the silent approbation and goodwill of impartial spectators. So, um, that's it's like Franklin in the autobiography talking about pushing a wheelbarrow through the city early in the morning filled with his work, to show how industrious he is.
Mhm.
uh, there's this always this very calculating, and I don't mean to say, I mean, I understand why people could find that objectionable because it seems to lack spontaneity and a kind of
sincerity or something like that, right?
great greatness of soul, where just
Yeah.
out of the fullness of your wonderfulness you bestow blessings on people and so forth. Everything seems to be a little too calculated. But for me, I've never found that criticism very compelling, because Franklin is really writing for people. He is really, I think, in this sense, this gets back to the opening about is he an American? He's really thinking about people like himself, people who had no advantages, they didn't get much education, and it's this constant emphasis on self-improvement.
Mhm.
How are we going to live as Republican citizens, self-governing, without the benefit of an organized religion, without the whether you think of it as a benefit or not, without the example of aristocrats who live this kind of graceful life because the law privileges them? How are we going to actually make this work? So that calculation is really devoted to that object, to trying to make all of us who will lack this, the uh, the accidental blessings of good birth and wealthy parents to provide us finishing school and riding fencing lessons and etiquette lessons. How are we going to actually get along and get through life and make the most of it, or and achieve some, actually achieve the happiness we pursue? And that's really, I think, what Franklin is about. So I've never been really offended by his constant rational calculation of these things, because it seems to me essential for if we are all created equal. And you imagine Franklin showing up in Philadelphia with nothing but couple of loaves of bread in his pocket, wandering around, and built this wonderful life for himself, but not just for himself. He produced enormous benefits for everyone around him, and through your grandparents, Chris was still benefiting you hundreds of years later. So.
Yeah, well, some of it took. Some of it didn't, but
yeah, just building on David's point. I mean, I really like what David just said in that comment, because I think there is in Franklin, part of what makes Franklin's advice so valuable, I think, and part of why people seized on it is because it has such general application. And if we look at one of the other documents here, the letter from Father Abraham, which is also in our readings for this session, that's a letter that, again, I think tries to offer some advice that everyone, regardless of education levels or class or money or where they are in society, what their situation is, that everyone can benefit from. Because one of the main arguments of the Father Abraham letter, I think, is simply that we all need to be self-aware. We all need to examine ourselves. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What are our motivations? Why are we in the position that we're in? What is it we're trying to do? What are our strengths and weaknesses? I mean, it's and you can see why Franklin has been applied to, not only self-help movements, but also sort of corporate literature, Thomas Peters kind of stuff about business culture and leadership, because so much of this has such broad applicability. But the idea of understanding your strengths and weaknesses, what you have to work on, how you come across to other people, how if you change certain things, you might be able to be more appealing or have more friends or do more with yourself. That kind of advice, I think, doesn't really to be self-examining and to examine yourselves that way. It doesn't really require money or income or wealth or power, but you might be able to rise in all those areas if you can do that. But then he also says it's not enough to sort of know yourself, basically. It's also important to have somebody else to be what he calls a monitor, somebody else who can sort of tell you how you are. And if any of us are fortunate to have a partner or a good friend who can sort of pull us aside and say, look, you're really being ridiculous here, or you've got to stop being so stubborn, or you're letting someone walk all over you, stand up for yourself. If we have a monitor like that who can, in our own lives, sort of help us see a reality that we might not be able to grasp ourselves, that's a key aspect. And I think that's what Franklin is doing here too. And again, this essay, I think, as with everything about Franklin, we can read it on multiple levels and have debates about what he's really saying and who he's aiming this for and who the audience is. But I think part of the appeal is it doesn't have to be just any particular audience. It can speak broadly to multiple audiences. And I think the idea of self-examining, being self-aware, but not trusting that that's enough, to sort of also go out and cultivate people who will be able to speak to you honestly, that's a great friend or colleague or spouse or partner. If you have someone like that, it's a great asset to anybody. And I think that's what Franklin has in mind here. So I think that's another kind of common sense application of Franklinian principles that could speak to a vast range of people.
That's a great point, Todd. And I've always loved that. I've always loved that letter, the Father Abraham letter. And when I've read the autobiography, I've tended to think of Franklin's purpose in the autobiography in light of what he's trying to do in that letter. That is, again, he's trying to play that role, that monitor or that good friend to others, some of whom he's never even met, right? Who might read this and take what he's saying to heart. And Franklin in his autobiography gives many instances in his younger life where he makes what he calls these errata, right? He makes mistakes.
Yeah.
And could have been his downfall, except in most cases somebody pointed out to him, hey, you're making a mistake. Sometimes it's somebody he barely knows. I think there's an example of an older woman. I don't know. I don't think it's in the excerpt that we've posted, but he's hanging around these two young ladies when he gets off the ship. Is it right when he gets to Philadelphia? Right. Yeah. And the woman says, "Be careful of those young ladies." And it turns out that they ended up in jail. So, and then he himself, even in his autobiography, tries to do that with his own friends, Ralph, and can't think of the other fellow's name. He tries to play that role, Todd, that you're describing. Mm-hmm. And they don't listen. And they end up unhappy. But Yeah, so I've tended to think his purpose in autobiography is very similar in his purpose in that letter. So, David, you were talking earlier about some of the criticism Franklin gets about the practicality of his advice in terms of sort of self-help and self-advancement and improving the quality of one's life. Um, but isn't it fair to say that Franklin's also pretty consistent when he says you can't help others if you can't help yourself either, right? So it seems like he actually kind of balances those two things out. Um, what am I trying to say here? I know in the 20th century, Franklin starts to get a bad rap, and sort of in the sort of post-progressive
Right.
Viewpoint as focusing too much on self-interest and self-help and self-improvement. But I see a lot in Franklin where he says you can't help others if you yourself aren't stable and can't support yourself and be successful. Is that a fair?
Yeah. I think that's his understanding of his own. I mean, you see that in the trajectory of his life. Todd mentioned this, that he was so industrious and careful that he was able to retire. And then the question became, what should he do? And he ended up devoting himself to public, various public tasks. That would not have been possible if he hadn't, in a certain sense, followed his own advice. And so the fact that there is this kind of calculating, you could say even self-interested aspect of Franklin's not incompatible with doing a lot of good for other people. In fact, I think Franklin would say, if you don't, as you say, Chris, attend to yourself and improve yourself, you'll never be in a position to help other people.
I thought that one of the sayings from the Poor Richard piece, the Way to Wealth piece, that I always remember is that line about this: an empty sack cannot stand upright. And again, I know in some scholarship in the 20th century that got him in trouble. That was taken as the statement of fill up your own sack, fill up your own bag with wealth. But I've always read that as though you don't just fill up the bag, you don't just fill up the sack. You can't take from the sack and give to others if it's not filled. But yeah, it seems like
also, I think to me, it's important to remember politically how was, okay, so all men are created equal, and therefore every citizen must have a voice. How are citizens actually going to have a voice? Jefferson's answer was everyone's going to own a farm and be able to provide for themselves out of this farm. Franklin's answer is everybody's going to get up at 5 a.m, work hard, study, et cetera, improve themselves and develop, make that sack stand up on its own. And that's really saying these are ways in which we are going to live as independent citizens. And without that, you have to wonder how is this new government supposed to work? In Britain, the contrast with Europe was people would say, well, we have rulers, by God's decree, so to speak, the king, and then the aristocracy spread out from that, and they are the ones who control society. Well, that's not going to happen in the United States. No established church, no established aristocratic classes. None of those things protected by law. So how is this going to work? And Jefferson and Franklin, I think, saw that problem and had two different answers, but they amount to saying you have to find some way for the new citizens of this new republic to be independent. And in that case, the government we propose will survive and prosper. If not, it's hard to see how it would have.
Yeah, I wanted to also jump in and come back to something that David and Chris had both talked about earlier, which I think is just a great point about this idea of bettering oneself and bettering society. I think the autobiography, it seems to me, is primarily concerned with individual improvement, right? It's about how a person can do better. You get up at 5, you read, you study, you work, you save, you do all this, you strive, and you gain and advance that way. That's really aimed at individuals. But many of Franklin's other writings, I think, are really aimed at community improvement and improving society. And one of the great examples, I think, is that the appeal for the hospital, where Franklin is sort of asking for contributions for this hospital, which is one of our readings also. I just wanted to read a passage here because it speaks exactly to what Chris and David were talking about, the sentiment, I think, that they captured in Franklin. This is in the appeal for the hospital. "We are in this world," Franklin says, "mutual hosts to each other. The circumstances and fortunes of men and families are continually changing. In the course of a few years, we have seen the rich become poor and the poor rich. Our present state, however prosperous it might be, hath no stability, but what depends on the good providence of God, how careful we should be not to harden our hearts against the distresses of our fellow creatures, lest we be in their situation one day as well." So Franklin, I think, is really someone who stresses this idea of doing well, doing good for society, doing well, helping others. And when you think about all the institutions that he had in creating, the lending library, for example, to put books in the hands of people who might not be able to buy them themselves, a fire company for mutual protection against fires, which of course in every colonial city could be absolutely devastating because of wood structures, because of the close proximity of buildings, so that if a fire starts, it's likely to spread very, very quickly. The idea of the hospital company, the library company, all these kinds of things, I think, for Franklin are examples of why we should do things to improve the lot of everyone else. And again, it comes back to another of those key Franklin themes, I think, which is that idea of humility. And this is in the article on chess as well. We may be up today, we may be doing well today, but we are just one illness, one accident, one fire, one disaster, one drought, one ship being destroyed on the ocean currents away from a disaster ourselves. Therefore, we need to think about others and help others and provide some mechanism for taking care of not just ourselves, but our neighbors. So I think Franklin, again, is very sympathetic, very kind of other directed in the sense that he's thinking of other people as well. So again, Franklin's lessons for improvement both speak to individuals, do these things and you can be more efficient and productive and successful, but also do these things also because we need to take care of our fellow creatures, as he puts it.
Yeah, those are great points. I'm reminded too, you were mentioning some of his inventions that were meant to improve society. One of my favorites is just the idea of installing gutters on the side of the streets in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
So that instead of all the filth piling up when it would rain, it would wash it all the way down toward New Jersey and let them deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was get the filth off of the streets. But we've got a couple of interesting points, questions coming in or comments coming in on both of your comments. So Shaylin asks about Franklin's invention of the lightning rod, the stove, etc., and not taking up patents. Is that not evidence of his? Is that evidence of that the criticism of his being all about self is not particularly accurate? And then James asks, what about public education? Did Franklin have anything to say about public education? Do either of you know about that?
I would say on the first point that that's an interesting point about patents, and there's a larger point which we don't need to talk about it extensively, but it's also connected with Franklin's attitude towards property. And it's similar. Both Jefferson and Franklin had similar attitudes towards patents and towards property. Less, but in both cases, I think they come down on the side of seeing patents as, Jefferson put it: if you give a patent to encourage industry, don't let the patent exist too long, because you shouldn't restrict these ideas to one person to benefit one person. I think that's Franklin's attitude as well.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that. So patents had a purpose. The purpose of patents would be to encourage industry, but not to restrict. That's interesting.
But you don't want them to be for 200 years or something, because you want those ideas used widely to benefit as many people as possible.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and just on the question of education, I think historians of education typically group Franklin with those who advocate a program of self-education, which is very, very clear from the writings here. I mean, most of what Franklin writes about is about how we can educate ourselves, how we can read and study, and how by talking to other people, we can always ask questions. If there's someone who's smarter than us or has read more, we benefit by talking to them and learning from them. So he really sort of advocates this idea of self-education, which was largely how Franklin himself worked. I don't know as much as I'd like to about Franklin's own writings about public education or calling for public education. Since he wrote so much about so many topics, I presume they're there. But the part about the piece of Franklin education that I know best is his writing about self-education and his plans there, and how those are often compared and contrasted with, say, Jefferson's plans and ideas when he writes to his daughters about what they should be reading and writing and things like this, and what other people have advocated in terms of educational plans for reading and writing and learning.
He did support the establishment of what was called the Academy in Philadelphia, which later became the University of Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
He did support that. So he did see public education as important. But again, if you're thinking about the kind of people Franklin knew would populate the United States, that formal education would be the privilege of a relatively small part of the population. So I think Todd is right to emphasize this insistence on self-education and doing it. And this was became a tradition in British, the British working class and in America, that, you'd think of famous examples like Lincoln, but it's not Lincoln alone or Franklin alone who were largely self-educated. It was not uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you pick up books and you start reading, and then you find others who are interested in having conversations about those books. That was most of Franklin's education as a young adult, anyway, right? I believe. I mean, he had some tutoring, very sporadic tutoring as a young boy. Stacy Moses asks on behalf of one of her students, what kind of education did Franklin himself have? I know that he had very little formal education, and I know at one point he started reading the books that were in his father's library, and I think he later sort of regrets that, doesn't he? Because there was nobody to really tell him what was worth reading.
He had I think it was his uncle who had a library filled with dogmatic theology, which Franklin didn't think was very helpful for getting through life. I mean, he had only a few years of formal schooling, what we would recognize as formal schooling, and he was removed. His father took him out of school largely because they couldn't afford to keep him in school. So he went to what I guess was called then a Latin school, which would be preparation for higher education. But then he ended up going to a school where they just taught reading and arithmetic but only for a short period.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was evident to Franklin's parents, and probably to anybody who met Franklin, and we see examples of that in the autobiography, that he was an unusual person, unusually intelligent and quick to learn. And his father, originally hoped, I guess, in a way, that he would go on to become a Presbyterian minister, which is a remarkable thought in retrospect. But he didn't get enough education for that to become a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the excerpt, I was trying to look at the excerpt from the autobiography. I don't think it includes the epitaph, does it, that he wrote for his
No, it doesn't.
parents' grave, which would be interesting to look at, the way he describes his father and mother, who bore a lot of children and raised a lot of children, and they got by, but they never really, they made a comfortable living or something to that effect. But I found that interesting in light of what you were saying. But Franklin, somebody asked, did he know Greek and Latin? I don't know the answer to that. If he did, he probably taught himself or had the fundamentals of Latin for a year or two in that basic education you were mentioning, David. But it seems to me, but he was hungry for an education, which might explain why he was so eager to put together these groups, these discussion groups, right? The
Mm-hmm.
Junto and my favorite society, the Society of the Free and Easy. I love that title.
That's right.
but he was always looking for people to have discussions with. And of course, sometimes that got him in trouble because when he was younger, he had that Socratic mode, as he says, until I think it was a Quaker friend that said, look, you're making more enemies than friends in the way you dispute these things. But you mentioned, David, his hopes, his father's hopes that he would become a minister. A lot of the things you and Todd had mentioned earlier about what Franklin's motives were, helping oneself to be able to help others, and thinking about the good of the community. That seemed to really affect his writings, which we have some examples of here, on how to think about personal virtues and also religion. How did he think about religion? I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on how he thought about religion, especially. And but we also have his list of virtues that he tried to inculcate in himself in the autobiography. And I wonder if either of you would care to comment on how well he did in trying to live up to that list of virtues.
Well, I want to hear David talk about religion in a second, but I just want to throw out one thing briefly first to speak to Chris's question. I think one of the overarching tendencies in so much of Franklin's advice is to cultivate this temperament of moderation, of being able to approach things not just in a moderate position of being between whatever the two extremes might be, but to cultivate moderation as a kind of temperament, of listening to the other person, of reaching out, of being willing to compromise, of looking for an effort to try to find common ground in conversation with people, which is also obviously a key piece of anything that diplomats would do, obviously, is to negotiate between two countries or two groups of any kind. And that's also something, of course, that Franklin famously praised the Constitutional Convention for being able to set aside various differences, to listen to the perspectives and concerns of those in other parts of the country who have different interests and different positions. And so this idea of striving for moderation, whatever its sources were, that I think is a running theme throughout Franklin in his commentary on how individuals can conduct themselves, on how diplomats should conduct themselves, on how chess players should conduct themselves, and on how political figures should conduct themselves as well. And I think that's a key theme for Franklin that really runs throughout these things. And yet, to answer another question you just raised a second ago, Franklin, how well did he follow his own advice? Probably about as well as any of us do, right? I mean, we're often very good at saying, do these things, don't do these things. But Franklin, for example, for all his hail fellow well met qualities, for all the idea of coming together and joining, Franklin, when he fought with people, fought bitterly. He often had fallings out with them. He had bitter conflicts with former friends. And of course, most famously, he had the falling out with his own son, William, who was a loyalist. And they were really, in some ways, never ever fully reconciled. So that was, I think, a great aspect of Franklin's life. He's a great dispenser of what we can agree on, I think, is very good advice. But again, because he's human, he doesn't always follow that advice, or he means to or tries to, but then gets diverted someplace. And I think in that sense, Franklin is a very human figure. And I think that's one of the appealing things about him too. But I want to hear David talk about Franklin and religion.
Well, before I do that, I did want to mention that, Franklin recounts his struggle with order. He never really got that virtue down. But there's another way in which I think there's, as Todd said early on, you always have to wonder how to read, or ask yourself how to read Franklin. But you remember that remark he makes that humility wasn't originally on his list.
Exactly.
And then he says later, if he ever succeeded in being humble, he would probably be proud of being humble. So there's this kind of undercurrent of humor in his account of this. And I've always thought, humility, what does he put down? Imitate Jesus and Socrates. I mean, what could be less humble than really trying to imitate Jesus or Socrates? But then also chastity. He says, rarely use venery, but for health or offspring. Well, we could all go along with that, right? I mean, how much of what sort of a limit is that?
Yeah.
Anyway, I think I don't mean to say that all of them are intended or not. He's not serious about them, but there's a way in which, as Todd was saying, I think it's true. You always have to wonder be careful, because Franklin is a remarkably playful person.
Right.
And despite this, this image he cultivated of himself, pushing the wheelbarrow through the street in the dark, and all this sort of stuff, he's constantly playing and being, pointing to the humor in things. It's one thing that, not only do we get that when we read him, but clearly that aspect of his character charmed people. He must have been a remarkable, dinner companion, and just, as they say, a great guy to have a beer with, right?
Yeah.
Endlessly amusing, very extremely intelligent, but also clever, witty. And I think that comes out in his own account of his struggles with order, and, and the remarks he makes about humility and so forth.
Right.
For religion, I think Franklin is pretty clear. He didn't really believe in, or he didn't really identify with any denomination. He had a view of religion as something, again, this emphasis on what's useful. Does it teach morality? I went to these sermons. All I heard was Presbyterian dogma. I stopped going. I mean, he supported churches. He points that out in his autobiography, but he didn't have any attachment to denominations or dogmatic theology. He was mostly focused on what's the moral teaching, what's the benefit, the moral benefit, the usefulness of the teaching of a religion.
As Andrew suggested that in his post he just put in the chat box about how he seems to have tired of churches because of this particular minister's failure to capitalize on the moral lessons embedded in this passage from Scripture, which Franklin said could have been really great in terms of instructing citizens on their sort of moral and civic duties, but instead all they heard was how to make somebody a better Presbyterian or Methodist, whichever it was. I can't remember, but
right, yeah, Presbyterian.
So
for me, the key there are, as far as my memory, as I remember, there are two places in the autobiography where he makes this statement. This is in the excerpt from the autobiography. It's on page 9, the second full paragraph. He says, in this piece, it was my design. He's talking about this book he was going to write, The Art of Virtue.
Right.
It was my design to explain and enforce this doctrine, that vicious actions are not hurtful because they are forbidden, but forbidden because they are hurtful, the nature of man alone considered, that it was therefore everyone's interest to be virtuous who wish to be happy, even in this world.
Yeah.
So that's another way of Franklin saying you shouldn't follow a moral code because Moses brought it down out of a cloud and presented it to you, and because it says these things are forbidden, you should do it with the recognition that it's good for you and it'll be good for other people and it's going to make you happy. So his point again is to ground these things, and it's, I think, important that he says the nature of man alone considered. In other words, he's not saying these things have or at least in this passage, he's de-emphasizing the supernatural sanction for morality and saying if you just look at human beings as they are, you can devise a code of conduct that will lead to a happy, productive life.
Yeah.
And again, I think in the context of the United States, where there's not going to be an established church, he's presenting a way of life that could actually work in the new republic, given the circumstances Americans are going to find themselves in.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. I've always thought of that pragmatic side of Franklin, especially, I mean, even when it comes to his political thought. He's surrounded by Jefferson and others, Madison, who are very well versed and educated in Enlightenment political thought. But I can't think of any place where Franklin takes his bearings from, say, the abstract political philosophy or political teachings of Locke or others. He tends to rely, David, as you say, much more on experience and just reasoning about things, about the nature of things, the nature of human beings, as you say. Um, I was always astonished at his sort of rejection of theory, or abstract theory, as you say, things that come down from the clouds, right, or the heavens, and so I can see that reflected in his approach to religion as well.
Yeah, I mean, he's somebody, again, I mean, the justification for it is that these are the people, it's the people of the United States who are going to rule. They're not going to be, I mean, of course, all human beings are to some degree affected by, popular fashion or authority figures or opinion makers, as we say, and so forth. But that's going to be much, and I think Franklin actually hoped that would be much less the case in the United States than in other places. And again, the context of this is that nobody has ever done this before. How is it actually going to work? And Franklin was, I think a fairly radical, despite the fact that he, was able to operate in European society. He was a fairly radical Republican. I mean, the Pennsylvania form of government, which he had a hand in crafting, was notoriously bottom up rather than top down. I mean, the executive was very weak. I mean, I know that was characteristic of many of the first
unicameral legislature.
Right. I know that not the unicameral so much, but the weak executive was characteristic of a lot of early state governments. But Franklin really believed in that, and so his version of republicanism was kind of radical for its time.
Yeah.
I think if I could just jump in and make one last point. I mean, I think there's a very good book by Gordon Wood called The Americanization of Benjamin Franklin. Came out maybe 2004 or something like that. And in that book, I mean, a lot of these themes that David has talked about, religious impulses, but others, all these were sort of crafted together by people in the Jacksonian era. I mean, Franklin died in 1790 after having fashioned his own image and fashioned his own career himself. But then Franklin sort of became Ben Franklin, the symbol, because of the creation of people during the Jacksonian era who emphasized, for example, Franklin as the coming of age story. They emphasized him as someone who was an apprentice who left home to go off and make his fortune and success. They emphasized, again, all these kinds of things that he did in that way, the self-made man, the artisan, not the diplomat, not the wealthy person. All of that was sort of a uniquely Jacksonian era kind of creation. And that sort of became what Wood argues, that's when Franklin became Americanized and became that great image. So there's sort of Franklin's own self-fashioning, and then there's the fashioning others did of Franklin to convert him into this great symbol. And we might ask the question, who was Franklin? Where is he in all this? I think Franklin had a hand in his own image, but I think then other people picked up strands of that to emphasize different parts of it that spoke to different eras. And that's very much, I think, what you see in the Jacksonian era, the up by the bootstraps, the self-made man idea. That comes very much out of a particular historical era where those kinds of benefits would be seen as particularly useful, particularly to the white males who obviously were the sort of target for that and who would be the people who were experiencing the great rise of democratization, of being able to vote, to own property, to hold office, to run for office, to have political power. All that was sort of new to them. And the Franklin myth was particularly appealing to people like that.
That's fascinating. I think that's a great point. I've actually kept you over a few minutes. I apologize for that, but these are great points to end on. So I want to thank you both very much for your time and your thoughts. And I've learned a great deal, as always, from this. So thank you both very much. Appreciate it.
This was great.
Thanks.
And I also want to thank our participants for the questions that drove a lot of this great conversation. Also, just a quick reminder about the email you will receive with the link for your certificate of participation. If you've enjoyed our conversation today, please look into the other resources Ashbrook provides, including free one-day seminars in over 20 states, which are based entirely on original documents and discussion. You can find a full schedule of these seminars by state on the tah.org website. Just click on seminars at the top of the screen, select one-day seminars as the category, and you can then search by state. You can also help us spread the word about our programs by sharing the archive link to your colleagues on social media. So thanks in advance for helping us do that. Our next Saturday webinar will be October 5th on Alexander Hamilton. That'll be fun to follow up to Franklin. Be an
That's
interesting
right.
conversation. So hope to see you all then. Until then, take care.
Thank you for listening to another TAH.org podcast. You can find archives of all our previous programs, as well as information about future programs at TAH.org/webinars, or on iTunes by searching for teachingamericanhistory.org.